Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is using his executive power to start undoing the Trump administration's immigration agenda as he tries to convince Congress to pass more coronavirus relief. Mr. Biden issued 3 executive orders. They direct the government to review the last administration's immigration and asylum restrictions, as well as creating a task force to help reunite hundreds of separated families.
There's a lot of talk, with good reason, about the number of executive orders that I have signed. I'm not making new law. I'm eliminating bad policy. We're going to work to undo the moral and national shame of the previous administration that literally, not figuratively, ripped children from the arms of their families, their mothers and fathers at the border, and with no plan, none whatsoever, to reunify the children who are still in custody and their parents.
The Associated Press reports the Biden administration has already deported hundreds of immigrants in its early days, despite pledging to stop removing those not considered threats. Last week, a federal judge suspended the administration's 100-day ban on deportations, but the ruling had not required the government to schedule any on their own. The Biden administration also announced plans on another front, revealing it will begin distributing a limited amount of COVID-19 vaccines directly to retail pharmacies. They're considering it a trial run to test a program where the federal government will ship directly to pharmacies. Meanwhile, today, President Biden and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen met with Senate Democrats about the White House's pandemic relief proposal. It came after a 2-hour-long sit-down with these 10 Republican senators Monday night, the first official Oval Office meeting of the Biden presidency. Here's what Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer relayed about the meeting.
We are not going to make the mistake of 2009 and have too small a package that took too long, and it took 4 or 5 years for the economy to recover. President Biden said he told Republicans he's willing to make some modifications, but he's very strong that the full American Rescue Plan get us through this crisis. Secretary Yellen said the Republican $600 billion wasn't close to enough, and specifically noted that it didn't do enough to help low-income families.
Lawmakers are trying to get a deal passed as the Senate is now just 1 week away from being able to start the second impeachment trial against former President Trump. House impeachment managers laid out their case against Mr. Trump in a brief Tuesday, arguing he, quote, summoned a mob to Washington and aimed them like a loaded cannon down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. Nancy Cordes, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Gabby Orr join me now. Nancy is CBS News Chief White House Correspondent. Caitlin is CBSN's political reporter. And Gabby is a White House reporter for Politico. Welcome to you all. Nancy, let's start with the immediate future of the coronavirus relief talks. What came out of this Senate Democratic meeting with President Biden and Secretary Yellen, and what still stands in the way before more aid is passed?
Well, you saw Democrats coming out of that meeting with the president, Elaine, very firm about the fact that they are moving ahead with a package that is, if not quite the size that they want, $1.9 trillion, is not going to be that much smaller. They said they want Republican input. They continue to seek that, but they're not using terminology that would suggest that this is the typical kind of back and forth negotiation you see when the two sides have to try and meet in the middle. What Democrats are suggesting here is that they've got the votes to do this on their own. But obviously, President Biden would very much like for this to be a bipartisan package. So he's seeking the input of Republicans, as he did in that 2-hour meeting. They are continuing to trade ideas. But what the president has said, what his aides have said, what now the Democratic leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, is saying is that they believe that they can't go much smaller than $1.9 trillion because it doesn't meet the moment. And remember, they wanted the last couple of packages to be much larger than they ended up being. So they think that this is their moment to go big. I do think that they will try to get Republican support, perhaps by coming down a little bit on first of all, the stimulus checks to many Americans, not necessarily on that $1,400 per person number, but perhaps they might limit a little bit more who gets the checks, the income distribution. But when it comes to other elements of the package, things like unemployment benefits, $400 a week through September, or money to help schools reopen, I don't think that they're going to be quite as willing to deal on those big ticket items than they have been when they had to make a deal in previous iterations of COVID relief bills.
Well, Caitlin, we're also seeing some interesting developments among Republicans in Congress, with the more institutional part of the party going up against the newer right wing. What can you tell us about what is going on with GOP Congresswomen Liz Cheney and Marjorie Taylor Greene?
That's right. These two women kind of illustrate a tale of two Republican parties. On one hand, with Taylor Greene, you have someone who has been talking about various conspiracy theories for years, and there has been a trail on the internet. Conspiracy theories, running a range of topics, some of which are too complicated and so out there that it's kind of hard to repeat exactly what they are, but some of them have been questioning things like the shooting in Parkland. On the other hand, you have Liz Cheney, the number 3 in-house leadership, once considered a rising star in the Republican Party and kind of a model for moving up the ranks into leadership. She has come under heavy criticism from her colleagues for voting to impeach the president a couple of weeks ago. She was one of 10 House Republicans to do so, and when she did so, she issued a really stern statement against the president's actions. But it's really interesting to see who has garnered the most criticism from Republicans in the conference. That's Liz Cheney, not necessarily Taylor Greene. There are questions about what Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, will do, how he will kind of operate ahead of a conference meeting that House Republicans will have tomorrow. There have been calls for Taylor Greene to lose her committee posts. We have seen McCarthy do that for members in the past. Remember, Congressman King from Iowa was stripped of his committee assignments because of racist comments he had made. So there are questions about whether McCarthy will do that. There are reports that Democrats are trying to pressure him to remove her from committee posts. Some of those committee posts include the Education Committee, trying to kind of force his hand and arguing that they will try to do so and get Republicans on record with a vote. There have also been calls within the conference to either censure Liz Cheney or remove her from her leadership post. So this kind of shows a kind of remarkable, these kind of stress tests that the party is facing after Donald Trump. And it's been really interesting to hear from someone from the other side of the Capitol, Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader now. He issued a rare statement saying that loony lies and conspiracy theories are a cancer for the Republican Party. That was, of course, aimed at Taylor Greene. And he also issued a statement coming to the defense of Liz Cheney. And that shows kind of the political reality that he is looking at, where Republicans have just lost the White House, they lost the Senate, and they still don't have control of the House. So as they're trying to plot the next 2 years to try to gain seats in the House and maybe take over the majority, try to win back seats in the Senate, he sees this, Taylor Greene, as someone who is very problematic for the party. The question is whether other Republicans in the House conference see it that way as well.
Yeah, as you point out, really, it's going to be fascinating to see what Kevin McCarthy does here in the days and weeks moving forward. Meantime, Gabby, as we mentioned, the Senate impeachment trial can begin as early as next Tuesday. How is former President Trump planning to defend himself against the charge of incitement of insurrection?
President's impeachment strategy in a brief that his team filed today. This was submitted by the 2 attorneys that he announced would be joining his defense team over the weekend. And in that brief, there were two key arguments made in response to the articles of impeachment that President Trump is facing. Number one was the constitutionality of the impeachment process. Repeatedly during this brief, his attorneys claim that this process is unconstitutional because President Trump has left office and is now a former president. And there is no precedent for impeaching somebody who doesn't actually hold office, a president that is. The second argument that they make is that every statement that the president made about election fraud, including during that Stop the Steal rally that occurred outside of the White House the morning of January 6th, is protected by the First Amendment. And there are some arguments that they make as part of that that don't really stand if you get into the nitty-gritty of them. On one hand, they say that the president never actually intended to interfere with the vote counting process that occurred on January 6th by the joint session of Congress. That is not true. If you look at some of the statements that the president made and the ongoing pressure campaign that he waged against Vice President Mike Pence to do something to bring that process to a halt and potentially recount votes in different states or pursue other legal challenges to overturn the 2020 election. And then there are also standards that need to be met when you're making a First Amendment argument that say, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. The same kind of thing applies to this question of whether the president's speech is responsible for inciting an insurrection. And there was very little inside this brief by the president's defense attorneys to actually talk about whether those standards were met and why his comments on January 6th do not fit under that definition. So there's a lot of holes that still are kind of being worked out behind the scenes in the president's legal argument heading into his Senate impeachment trial next week. We do know, however, that the president has wanted to focus on election fraud and his continued quest for election reforms as part of this impeachment process. His previous legal team that departed over the weekend did not seem keen on participating in that. And I think based on the brief that we saw this morning from his current legal team, it's clear that they've also tried to sort of couch those arguments in a broader legal framework that will appeal to Senate Republicans.
And Gabby, you also have some new reporting on why conservative political groups are not backing Mr. Trump in this impeachment trial as much as they did for his first. Why not?
Well, we did see a lot of conservative groups back in the fall of 2019 and January of 2020 come to the president's defense over his first impeachment. They organized phone calls, they issued talking points, they booked surrogates to defend him on television, they sent out mailers to voters. And it's important to remember that that was all happening at the same time of a pivotal election, both for the House, Senate, and the White House. And so it was really a motivating factor to kind of galvanize the grassroots and use impeachment to wage this outrage campaign. The difference now is that we're still 21 months away from the next election, the 2022 midterm elections. And so there isn't really that angst among these conservative groups to use this to rally their voters because, of course, voters do have a short memory, and 21 months away, are they going to be talking about the president's second impeachment, and is that going to be a motivating factor behind their vote is a big question. And so a lot of these groups just don't want to invest the resources. They want to preserve their war chests for 2022, and they also feel like the outcome of this Senate trial is preordained. We already saw more than 40 Senate Republicans in a vote basically say that this is an unconstitutional process, and so we have a pretty good idea of how they're actually going to vote after the evidence is presented. And so a lot of these groups feel that the president will be acquitted, that this process isn't necessarily constitutional according to them, and they don't want to get involved.
Switching gears, Caitlin, last night, New York Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezz shared her story of hiding inside the Capitol during last month's riot. She said she feared she would not make it out of the Capitol alive. What did we learn from her firsthand account?
Yeah, that firsthand account given in an hour-and-a-half long Instagram live video that has now over 3.5 million views shows the extent to the Congresswoman's reach. This was significant because she recounted her experiences on that day, nearly a month ago, when the insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, and she spoke to kind of directly to the criticisms of going forward with the impeachment trial, which have been kind of, look, let's move on for the good of the country, let's put this behind us. She was saying that, look, trauma is still very real, and those are the same arguments, she said, that people say to survivors of sexual assault. And in doing so, she revealed for the first time that she herself was a survivor of sexual assault and described the similarities in terms of the trauma and the compounding trauma. And this is really significant, not only for those details, revealing that for the first time, but also because this comes against the backdrop of the Senate getting ready to have the impeachment trial, the conviction trial for former President Trump. And you've heard kind of a lot of arguments around focused on process, especially from Republicans who have been arguing to move on, who have been arguing that it's not constitutional to convict a former president who's no longer in office. And this kind of message spoke to the kind of accountability argument that a lot of Democrats have been waging, that just because this happened and it's over doesn't mean there shouldn't be accountability. And it also speaks to the ways in which this impeachment trial differs so vastly from the one a year ago, because these are lawmakers who were directly affected by the events that happened on January 6th. And the more that we learn about those events and the more arrests are coming by the day, including today, the more just completely striking and devastating. So that kind of firsthand account speaks to the ways in which lawmakers supportive of impeachment and conviction are kind of thinking about this, and that will kind of color perhaps what we see next week.
Yeah, and as you point out, tremendous interest in that Instagram Live video has millions of views and counting. Finally, Nancy, I want to ask about vaccines. We're going to have more on this a little later, but what can you tell us about this government program to ship vaccines directly to retail pharmacies? What is the Biden administration's goal here?
The goal is to take a little bit of the pressure off of public health systems all around the country that are now working overtime to vaccinate people as quickly as possible. Pharmacies are set up to do exactly this. They give out the flu vaccine every year. They have employees who are trained in delivering vaccines, so why not bring them into the effort in a more formal, fulsome way? The pharmacies had been involved already. They were tasked with providing the vaccine primarily to people who were living in nursing homes, but now the program's going to be expanded. So starting next week, you'll have about 1 million doses that will be sent directly to 6,500 pharmacies around the country. And that's over and above the 10.5 million that the White House now says is going to be going out on a weekly basis for the next few weeks, and then they hope it'll ramp up from there. That's to start, 6,500 pharmacies, CVS, Walgreens, that type of thing. And then eventually, Jeff Zients, who is the head of the COVID response team at the White House, said eventually could get to 40,000 pharmacies around the country. And beyond taking the pressure off of the public health system right now, there's another practical reason to do this, and that is that if people need to get a coronavirus vaccine every year eventually, the same way they get a flu vaccine right now, you're going to need these pharmacies to be deeply involved with that effort, the same way that they give the flu vaccine out year after year right now. So it just makes sense to bring them into the system in a much more purposeful way, and that's what they're going to start to try to do this month.
All right, Nancy Cortez, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Gabby Orr, great to have you all. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.